I've driven almost every road in this country. From busy highways to lost alleys in the middle of nowhere, I've always prided myself on knowing every mile of asphalt like the back of my hand. But that night, that damn night, I came across a road I'd never heard of before, US 666. It didn't show up on the GPS, and until that moment, I believed that no route could ever surprise me. When I accepted the job, it seemed like a straightforward trip. The pay was good, and the deadline was tight, as usual. But just before setting off, I got a call from my dispatcher. A landslide had blocked the main route, and I had to take an alternate path, a small secondary road that only showed up on old maps. I had no choice. I pulled out my old paper map, the kind you only use as a last resort, and there it was, a twisted line, almost faded in the lower corner. No digital signal, no references on modern signs. Just a forgotten trace, like it shouldn't even be there. I hesitated for a moment, but decided to take it. I needed to make the deadline. As soon as I took the detour, I felt something off. The road seemed wrong. The asphalt was uneven, full of potholes, and the signs were rusted and covered in vegetation, as if no one had passed through there for years. Everything around me felt dead. But the delivery was important, so I kept going. It was just an alternate route, I told myself. As I drove on, I started to notice subtle changes. The outside sounds vanished, no crickets, no rustling of trees. Just the lonely hum of the engine. An oppressive silence that seemed to press against the cabin windows. A few more miles in, and things got worse. I looked in the rearview mirror, and I swear I saw reflections of lights behind me, as if there was another vehicle in the darkness, but every time I looked again, nothing. That's when the signs began to appear. First, one indicating a sharp left turn. I slowed down, looked around, but the road stayed straight. I ignored it. Maybe just vandalism. But then came more: danger, landslide ahead. Caution, detour zone. Rusty signs covered in moss, always warning of non-existent dangers. I didn't know if I should laugh at the situation or just turn back. But turning back seemed scarier than moving forward. That road made no sense. Every mile I covered left me more tense, as if I were being watched. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel, my eyes glued to the side mirrors, waiting to see something, anything. But all that remained was the silence, the engine, and the crushing feeling that I was utterly alone on that damned road. Or maybe I wasn't so alone after all. The silence was almost palpable, a weight that accumulated with every kilometer. But then the radio, which had only been emitting static until then, started to pick up something. At first, it was just a distant whisper, as if someone was speaking from the other side of the frequency. I turned up the volume, furrowing my brow. "Help, someone, please," I heard a trembling voice. My hands grew cold on the steering wheel. I stopped breathing for a moment, trying to focus on what I was hearing. The voices were faint, as if they were very far away, in a place the radio shouldn't be able to reach. One male voice stood out, deep and urgent. "Don't stop, don't look back," the phrase repeated, interrupted by a louder static, as if someone were trying to cut the transmission. My eyes instinctively moved to the rearview mirrors, but there was nothing. Just the dark emptiness of the road. Other voices emerged next, a frantic and desperate murmur. They seemed to struggle to be heard, a chaos of mixed words. "Help us, you'll get lost too, don't leave the truck." The static returned, louder, and then a low laugh, so low it barely sounded human, echoed through the speakers. My heart skipped, and I instinctively turned off the radio. The silence returned, even more suffocating than before. Not wanting to think too much about it, I kept driving, my eyes fixed on the road. After what felt like hours, I spotted a distant glow. A gas station. An irrational sense of relief washed over me. At least I wasn't alone. The place looked old, the neon sign flickering weakly, as if it hadn't been maintained in decades. But I needed fuel. I decided to stop. As I pulled in, an old mechanic emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, his face hidden under the brim of a dirty cap. He seemed to have come out of nowhere, and his gaze was strange, as if he knew more than he should. The sound of my truck's engine still echoed when he slowly approached. "You shouldn't be here," he murmured, almost to himself, as he wiped his hands with a dark rag. "This road is a place where the living and the dead share the same path." My stomach churned. I didn't know if he was joking or if this was some kind of trick to scare me, but there was something in his voice that made me freeze. I tried not to show my discomfort and simply asked where the gas tank was. He stopped and stared at me, his small eyes shining in the dim light. "Listen, don't stop for any reason. And if you hear something tapping at the door, don't look inside. No matter what happens, keep your eyes on the road." Before I could ask what the hell he meant by that, he just moved away to fill up the truck. A deep silence enveloped us as the gasoline filled the tank. As soon as he finished, the old man disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. I stared into the darkness for a while, his words echoing in my head. But I still had a delivery to make, so I got back on the road. I had no idea what that man meant, but as the fog thickened again, a growing discomfort took hold of me. That's when I saw her. A young woman, standing on the shoulder, waving desperately. Her body was covered in blood, her clothes in tatters, her face a mask of panic. I immediately recalled the mechanic's warning, but instinct, and perhaps guilt, made me slow down. I couldn't leave her there. "Are you okay?" I asked, rolling down the window. She just looked at me with wide eyes, as if I were the last thread of hope she could cling to. "Please, help me." Her voice was a desperate whisper. I looked around, but there was no one else. I let out a heavy sigh and unlocked the door. As soon as she got in, breathing heavily and gasping, everything seemed to change. She slowly turned her pale face toward me and whispered, in a voice that seemed to come from a much deeper place, "He's behind you." It was at that moment that the truck's engine died. Silence settled in, even more suffocating. I tried to turn the key, but nothing happened. That's when I noticed the trees around me beginning to bend, as if something gigantic were moving in the underbrush. Shadows stretched out, as if the darkness had a life of its own. And then, I realized I was no longer alone. Figures moved in the fog, appearing and disappearing. I felt a chill run up my spine. The young woman curled up in the passenger seat, her wide eyes staring fixedly at the rearview mirror. I didn't have the courage to turn my face and see what she was looking at, because I knew that whatever was there was waiting for me to look. The engine was dead, and the silence that followed was crushing. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white, trying to control my breathing. The young woman beside me began to writhe, groaning in pain as if something were tearing her apart from the inside. Her pale skin seemed to stretch, and her eyes, which had once pleaded for help, now stared at me with an empty, almost monstrous glint. I didn't know what to do. That's when I heard the first footsteps outside. Slow, dragging footsteps, as if bare feet were walking on the uneven asphalt. I turned my head to the rearview mirror, but the darkness outside was almost solid, impenetrable. A cold sweat trickled down my neck. The footsteps continued, now closer. Something began to scratch against the truck's metal, first on the side, then on the back window. It was a rhythmic sound, a tap tap tap, like long nails scraping against the metal. Who's there?" I murmured, lacking the courage to open the door or roll down the window. But deep down, I knew I didn't want to see. The young woman beside me shrank further down, her lips trembling as if she were fighting not to scream. "They're here," she whispered. Don't look at them." But then, as if her words were a command, something began to pound against the windows. First on the driver's side, then on hers. A loud, insistent sound, as if someone were trying to force their way in. I turned the key desperately, but the engine remained dead. I was stuck there, in the middle of a road that shouldn't exist, surrounded by whatever those things were. The truck's radio, which I had turned off, turned itself back on, crackling furiously. I tried to turn down the volume, but it kept increasing, the static transforming into fragmented voices. "Help, please, don't stop, the voices pleaded, a mix of screams and agonized whispers. The young woman trembled uncontrollably, as if she could feel each of those voices inside her. They are trapped too, like me," she murmured, her eyes unfocused as if she were seeing something far beyond the truck. "We all stayed, because we stopped. The road isn't real, it's a place, it's a limbo. The limbo of the drivers." My hands trembled. "What are you talking about? What the hell is this road?" I asked, almost unable to form the words. The young woman laughed, but it was a sound without joy, without life. "You entered the US 666. And those who enter, don't leave. Not until the road decides who should stay." She slowly turned, and her eyes were now black, with no pupils. "You are the next." My heart raced. The pounding outside grew more violent. The figures, which I could only catch glimpses of through the fog, began to crowd around, pressing against the windows, formless faces, distorted human shadows. The radio exploded in a high-pitched scream, "You are next." The young woman writhed again, and for a moment, her skin tore open, revealing something dark and pulsating underneath. A soul, condemned to this place. She was like them. A lure. A soul destined to draw others into this hell. I don't want to stay here," I shouted, my voice hoarse and desperate. But the road seemed to bind me, as if invisible hands were holding the truck in place. "How do I get out of here?" She smiled, a distorted, broken smile. "There's only one way. Either I stay, or you do." The words hit me like a punch. I had to choose. The road demanded a sacrifice. One of us had to stay, so the other could escape. My body trembled uncontrollably as I looked at her. A young woman, a lost soul who just wanted to be free. Would I have to throw her back into hell to save myself? Or would I surrender to this? The pounding on the windows was unbearable, the figures outside calling to me, high-pitched voices, screams echoing on the radio and in my mind. I closed my eyes, the decision forming in my head when, suddenly, the truck's engine sputtered. I opened my eyes, incredulous, and saw the dashboard light up on its own. The engine roared to life, and the road ahead began to distort. The asphalt opened up as if it were fabric, a chasm of red light emerging in the middle of the road. Screams echoed from within that void. Human, agonized screams, calling for me. Figures began to emerge, skeletal hands trying to grasp the edges of the hole. Everything around the truck trembled, as if the road itself were alive, trying to decide my fate. I took a deep breath, my face covered in sweat, and looked at the young woman. Her eyes pleaded, but she was no longer human. She was no longer a victim. She was part of this place, part of the horror trying to trap me. I closed my eyes and made my decision. When I opened them again, the truck was moving. The figures outside disappeared, and the road stretched out before me once more, normal. No chasms, no fog, no shadows. I looked at the passenger seat, empty. I was alone. I heard one last sigh on the radio, a low and sad sound, thank you, and then, silence. I kept driving. I knew I would never see that road again. But every time I took a new detour, a new unknown path, the fear returned. Because if I ever ended up in a place like that, I knew my chance to choose would be over. My name is Stones, I'm a truck driver, and for years I've been crossing the roads of the USA. The wind, the open road, and the freedom of life on the highway have always been my home. But on one of my trips, something peculiar started happening. At the first stop, a small place by the roadside, I met the attendant. An elderly man with gray hair and a friendly expression greeted me with a smile as I ordered a coffee. We chatted briefly, and then I continued on my way. At the second stop, the same thing. The same man was there, serving coffee and making small jokes. I found it curious, but the road was calling, and I didn't think much of it. At the third stop, something began to stand out. When I entered the place, the attendant greeted me with a familiar wave. "Hi, Stones. How's the trip going?" The tone of his voice felt strangely comforting. I couldn't ignore the sense of déjà vu. After a few exchanges, I left the stop, confused, but didn't give it much attention. It was at the fourth stop that I could no longer ignore it. When I walked in, the man was there again, identical, as if time hadn't passed. "Stones. Good to see you again. You're on quite a journey." He smiled, and I started to wonder how it was possible. The same man, in such different and distant places, always serving me. I decided that at the next stop, I would confront him. If I found him again, I needed to understand what was happening. Finally, at the fifth stop, my heart raced as I stepped down from the truck. The place was the same, and of course, he was there, behind the counter, with that same smile. "Mr. Carter," I said, almost unconsciously. He looked at me, surprised, but without losing his warm expression. "Yes, my son," he replied, as if he had been expecting this question. "Why are you in all the stops?" I asked, anxiety rising. "How can you be here at every place I pass?" He hesitated for a moment, his gaze deepening. "Because I'm your father, Stones. I'm accompanying you on your journey." Those words hit me like a bolt of lightning. My father had died when I was just a baby. I remember hearing stories about him, but I never met him. What that man was saying was impossible. "No, that can't be true," I murmured, trying to process it. "My father died before I was born." "Yes, but the bond between us is stronger than you can imagine. I'm here, at every stop, always by your side. Even in death, I'm following you, trying to communicate," he explained, with a serenity that left me uneasy. "But how? Why didn't I realize this before?" I asked, confused and distressed. The man I thought was just a simple attendant had become an enigma that challenged all logic. With my mind spinning and my heart heavy, I stepped back, unable to find the right words. I didn't understand what it meant. How could my father be present at all those stops while I traveled roads he never had the chance to travel? The last thing I heard as I left the stop was, "Stones, I'm always with you." And as the truck's engine roared and I drove away, I knew that mystery would follow me with every mile I traveled. The road never seemed so long and lonely, but now, somehow, I wasn't truly alone. I am Mike, a trucker with years of experience on the road, and on that hot summer night, I stopped at one of those truck stops that seemed to have come straight out of a nightmare. The place was isolated, a worn stretch of asphalt surrounded by tall, thick trees that appeared to lean in, watching me. The dim lights of the stop flickered, giving an air of abandonment and desolation. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of insects and the rustling of leaves, as if the night itself were breathing. I parked my truck and turned off the engine, feeling the fatigue accumulate in my shoulders. All I wanted was a bit of rest before continuing my journey. But as I prepared to settle in, something made me hesitate. There was a strange feeling in the air, a restlessness I couldn't ignore. It was as if the shadows were moving, dancing around the stop, and a whispering voice was calling me from the depths of the darkness. My senses went on high alert. I heard indistinct whispers that seemed to float on the breeze. I looked around, trying to identify the source of the sounds, but all I saw were the trees swaying gently, as if they were conversing among themselves. The pressure of the silence made the situation even more uncomfortable, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger by the second. Finally, a shadow darted between the trees, quick and furtive. My heart raced, and I turned abruptly, but when I looked, there was nothing there. Just the dense, oppressive darkness, as if I were being swallowed by the void. A wave of anxiety washed over me. I knew it wasn't normal to feel scared at a truck stop, but something that night told me I was not alone. And then, with a mix of curiosity and terror, I wondered what was truly hidden in that darkness, waiting for me. I woke up to faint knocks, an irregular sound reverberating through the walls of my truck. My heart raced, and the darkness around me felt denser. With a lump in my throat, I shook off my sleep and looked out the window. The silence was almost deafening, but the knocks continued. I got up, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling settling in my chest. As I stepped out of the truck and took my first steps into the stop, a cold breeze swept through the place, causing the hairs on my arms to stand on end. I looked around, trying to locate the source of the knocks, and that's when I saw it. A pale, indistinct figure wandered near the entrance of the stop, as if it were lost. My instinct screamed for me to turn back, but something kept me paralyzed, glued to the scene. The figure began to approach, and with each step, its features became clearer. What was once a shadow now transformed into a specter, a whitish, ethereal form that floated weightlessly. The eyes, empty and sad, seemed to look directly into my soul. The air around me grew cold, and I realized I wasn't seeing a mere lost traveler, but rather the spirit of a trucker who had died there years ago. In a whispering voice, the figure began to tell its story. It spoke of the fateful night it was murdered, the tension that hung in the air, and the betrayal that led to its death during a robbery. Each word was heavy with pain and rage, and I could feel the tragedy of its fate resonating in every syllable. The spirit revealed that it was trapped at that stop, between dimensions, waiting for revenge or perhaps a bit of peace. It described the final moments of its life, the despair in its eyes as life slipped away, and the need for justice that kept it there, an anchor of pain it could not release. I was overwhelmed by a mix of compassion and fear. That story, that suffering, all felt too real. As I listened, I realized that somehow, I had become part of that cycle of pain, and the question pounding in my mind was, what would I do with this revelation? How could I help a lost soul when the very stop was shrouded in dark secrets? The presence of the spirit became more intense, almost palpable, and the sense of threat hung in the air like a heavy fog. The wind howled around me, and the dim lights of the stop flickered, creating shadows that danced in a sinister manner. Each word from the spirit reverberated in my chest, and I knew time was running out. I needed to make a decision. "Help me find peace," he whispered, his voice echoing in my mind. The pain and desperation were clear, but there was also a plea in his words. I couldn't tear my gaze away from his empty eyes, now filled with profound sadness, and a part of me wanted to help. But the fear, that primal fear that burrowed into my flesh, whispered that fleeing was the better option. The stop was alive with supernatural elements. The air grew colder, and I could feel a presence around me, shadows forming and distorting. The truck, which had once been my shelter, now felt like a trap, the doors locked as if they wanted to keep me inside. I looked around, seeing the trees swaying strangely, as if they were trying to close in on me. It was as if the stop was closing in, surrounding me, and the only way out was the decision I was about to make. "I can help you," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. The spirit lit up with a glow that almost blinded me, and a wave of hope filled the space between us. But at the same time, the strength of his presence became threatening, as if he were testing my determination. I remembered the stories I had heard about the stop. Other trapped souls, other truckers who never left. What would happen if I chose to flee? A cold feeling in my gut made me hesitate. Would I become another part of that legend, a warning for those who came after me? If I decided to help, perhaps the light glowing around us could truly offer rest to the spirit, freeing him from the chains that bound him. But what if it didn't work? What if his presence intensified and led to something even more terrible? What would become of me? Time seemed to drag as the shadows drew closer. Finally, with a gesture of courage, I made a decision. I had to try. Tell me how I can help you find peace. The light around us began to pulse, and I realized the spirit was moving toward me. A wave of warmth enveloped me, and suddenly, the knocks echoing at the stop transformed into a soft whisper. "Thank you," he murmured, and before I could comprehend, a brilliant light erupted around us. With one last look at the spirit, I saw a look of relief on his face as he dissipated into the light. The environment began to transform. The weight in the air vanished, and the shadows receded, revealing a starry sky above. And then everything fell silent. The stop, now calm and peaceful, seemed rejuvenated. I took a deep breath, feeling that the place had been free from a curse that had weighed upon it for so long. I had chosen to help, and that decision brought peace to both the spirit and me. But as I looked back to where the shadows had dissipated, a part of me would always know that the struggle between light and darkness would never completely end. And as I returned to my truck, I knew I had made the right choice, but there would always be a part of the stop, a story that would remain for those who still ventured along those lonely roads.